Picture New York from above. The Manhattan skyline, glittering and dense, dissolves into something else: dark upstate forest, a fog-choked highway, a coastal marsh where the reeds don't move. Every one of these people was minutes from home. None of them made it. 10 people. 10 ordinary New York places. 10 empty spaces where they should be. Pull up the map, lock the door, and let's trace every last step. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. Easter Sunday, 1994. Rural Oswego County, New York. State routes 104 and 104B cross each other in the kind of nowhere junction that exists only to give long-haul drivers a landmark. A flat intersection. Open fields pressing in from both sides. A tree line in the distance that doesn't offer anything in the way of comfort or cover. It just sits there, dark and patient, at the edge of everything. At that crossroads stands a small convenience store called the D&W. Gas pumps out front, the kind with the old analog price displays. Fluorescent lights buzzing inside, the kind that make the space look the same at 6 in the morning as it does at midnight. A single cashier on shift since before sunrise, in a building no bigger than a living room, where the only sounds are the hum of the coolers and the occasional creak of the door when someone comes in from the cold. Her name was Heidi Marie Allen, and she was 18 years old. Heidi had taken the shift as a favor. A coworker wanted to spend Easter morning with their family, and Heidi was the kind of person who said yes to that without making it a production. She'd opened the D&W at around 5:45 in the morning, alone, in the dark, in a part of New York where the nearest neighbor is measured in field lengths rather than footsteps. She'd worked the register. She'd stocked shelves. She'd done everything right. By all accounts, she moved through that early shift with the practiced calm of someone who had done it before. A young woman doing an ordinary thing on a quiet holiday morning, watching the sky slowly shift from black to gray through the windows, waiting for the first customers to roll in off the highway. Here's the thing about Heidi Allen that matters, beyond the surface details. She was college-bound, sharp, and by every account, content. She wasn't running from anything. She had plans, a future she was actively building toward. The night before her shift, she'd reportedly been at home with her family, singing an Easter song. That detail sits there quietly and doesn't let go the image of a girl in the warmth of her house the night before, with her family around her, with no reason in the world to think the next morning would be different from any other morning she had ever lived through. She was the kind of young woman who showed up early, did the job, and went home. She was supposed to go home. The morning of April 3rd moved normally, at least at first. Customers came and went in the thin, early light, the kind of Easter morning traffic you'd expect on a rural state highway running through farm country. A few regulars, maybe a trucker stopping for coffee before pushing farther west. People filling their tanks before a long drive to visit family. Heidi processed each transaction, made change, exchanged whatever brief morning pleasantries strangers exchange at a convenience store counter before sliding back out into the cold air and pulling the door shut behind them. The routine was tight, repetitive, and unremarkable. The coolers hummed, the pumps clicked. The highway outside carried its thin trickle of early morning traffic without incident. Nothing about the first 2 hours of her shift suggested anything other than a normal open. At 7:42 in the morning, she completed what would later be identified as her last confirmed register transaction, a sale, a receipt. The machine recorded the time with complete indifference to what came next, the way machines always do. The timestamp sat there in the system, waiting to become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would drag through courts, excavations, and decades of unanswered questions. At 7:42, Heidi Allen was behind that counter, doing her job. That is the last, solid, documented trace of her, and that is where the record goes silent. Sometime between that 7:42 timestamp and approximately 7:55 to 8:15 in the morning, a window of somewhere between 13 and 33 minutes, a passerby approached the D&W and found something wrong. The store was open. The lights were on. The gas pumps were running. The numbers rolling on the displays. But there was no clerk. Nobody behind the counter. Nobody in the back room. Nobody answering when the passerby called out into the store. The door had not been locked from the inside or the outside. The cash register had not been emptied. There was no sign of a robbery, nothing ransacked, nothing broken, no drawer pulled. Heidi's purse was still there, sitting behind the counter where she'd left it. Her keys, her jacket still hanging on its hook near the door. Her car parked in the lot where she'd pulled in before sunrise, exactly where she'd left it hours earlier, going nowhere. The only thing missing was Heidi herself. A deputy was flagged down, then another. Within minutes, law enforcement understood they were not looking at a break-in, an accident, or a walkaway. Everything Heidi owned that morning was still at the D&W. The register still held its money. The coolers were still humming their patient, mechanical hum. The store was open for business as though she'd simply stepped outside for a moment and would be right back. She was not right back. She did not come back at all. This is where it stops being normal. Here's what doesn't make sense, and what has haunted this case for 30 years. The window itself. She had been at the register at 7:42. She was confirmed missing before 8:15. That is a span of somewhere between 13 and 33 minutes, at a publicly accessible highway junction, in the growing light of an April morning. Route 104 is not a back road. It is a New York State highway. Cars pass with regularity. People stop for gas on their way somewhere else. The pump island was visible from the road. The store had windows facing the highway. And yet whoever took Heidi Allen, and the evidence points clearly toward taken, not wandered, did so in a place and in a time frame that should have made it nearly impossible to do invisibly. Not a single witness reported seeing something clearly enough in that short and very public window to stop what was happening or to conclusively document it in real time. An 18-year-old woman was removed from a public building on a state highway during daylight hours, and the world outside kept moving as though nothing had shifted. The search that followed was unlike anything Oswego County had seen before or has seen since. National Guard units were deployed into the fields and woodlands surrounding the junction, combing terrain that looks open from the road but turns out to be laced with gullies, drainage ditches, and dense scrub the moment you step off the asphalt. Elements of the 10th Mountain Division, a United States Army unit stationed at nearby Fort Drum, less than an hour's drive to the northeast, were brought in to support ground searches across the wider region. Hundreds of volunteers showed up at staging areas each morning and fanned out in organized lines across the countryside, covering ground that took days to sweep properly. Divers worked ponds and waterways within a radius that kept expanding as the days passed without a result. Law enforcement canvassed every property, every outbuilding, every tree line, every barn within range of the junction. For weeks, the crossroads at routes 104 and 104B became the kind of place where television cameras set up before dawn, and parents in the surrounding towns found themselves unable to talk about much else. The store stayed in people's peripheral vision every time they drove past, sitting at that flat intersection like a question that wouldn't close. No trace of Heidi was found. A witness came forward and reported seeing two men near the store that morning, in the vicinity of a van, with a young woman being led toward it. That account became load-bearing in the investigation. Two brothers from the area, Richard and Jeffrey Thibodeau, eventually came under intense scrutiny and were tried separately. Richard Thibodeau was convicted of kidnapping in 1995. Jeffrey Thibodeau was acquitted. Richard's conviction was later overturned on appeal, and he was retried and convicted again. The legal record around this case is not clean or simple. It is a document of contested testimony, shifting accounts, and a justice system working through a crime that left almost nothing physical to hold on to. Here's the critical detail that has kept investigators and legal observers circling this case for decades. There has never been a body, no physical remains, no confirmed location, no forensic anchor to fix the crime to a place or a time beyond that 7:42 register timestamp. The prosecution in each proceeding rested substantially on testimony, and testimony is a thing that shifts under pressure, that gets re-examined on appeal, that looks different depending on who is asking the questions and what has changed in the years since. Witnesses recanted, accounts evolved, a theory officially unconfirmed, labeled firmly as a theory that Heidi may have been targeted deliberately rather than at random, possibly connected to informant dynamics running through the social currents of that tight rural community, has never hardened into established fact. It remains a theory The record is honest about that, even when the coverage around it has not always been. In 2014, investigators conducted an excavation at a cabin property connected to the case. It required heavy equipment. It generated the specific, awful dread of a search that might finally answer something after 2 decades of silence. They found nothing that resolved anything. A bracelet connected to Heidi reportedly resurfaced years after her disappearance, under circumstances that were never cleanly explained in the public record. That detail has circulated through coverage of the case without resolution. It is the kind of thing that arrives and refuses to say what it means, that sits at the edge of the known facts and points at a darkness that the investigation has never been able to fully illuminate. What remains is this: a gas station at a rural crossroads in Oswego County, an open door on an Easter morning in 1994, a register that logged its last transaction at 7:42 and then waited, entirely indifferent, for a clerk who never came back, the cash still sitting in the drawer, the jacket on the hook, the car in the lot, an 18-year-old girl who said yes to covering a holiday shift, who opened that store before the sun was up, who sang an Easter song the night before with her family, and who has not been seen since. The question of exactly what happened inside that 13 to 33-minute window on April 3rd, 1994, who was there, what was said, where she was taken, where she is now remains, by any honest accounting, completely unanswered. The next one is worse, because the missing person was 6 years old, and he was almost home. May 25th, 1979, Soho, Manhattan. If you know New York City today, you know Soho as a place of expensive boutiques and weekend crowds and cast-iron buildings that have been photographed so many times, they've become a kind of shorthand for the city itself. But in 1979, Soho was something different, a working artist's neighborhood, gritty and loose, with loft spaces converted from old manufacturing floors and streets that still carried the industrial weight of whatever the neighborhood had been before the painters and sculptors moved in. The buildings were solid and wide-shouldered, their facades decorated with the kind of ornamental ironwork that had once been purely functional and was now, by accident of history, beautiful. The sidewalks were broad. The blocks were short. The streets ran in a grid so logical that a child who had grown up on those blocks would know every storefront, every stoop, every fire hydrant and bodega awning between one corner and the next. It was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of neighborhood a parent could feel comfortable letting a child navigate alone, familiar, populated, legible in all directions. At 113 Prince Street, in a loft apartment in the middle of that neighborhood, a 6-year-old boy was getting ready to walk to his school bus stop for the first time by himself. His name was Eitan Patz. He was small, blonde, and by every account the kind of child who made adults stop and pay attention, not because he demanded it, but because he simply radiated a quality that drew people in. He was wearing a blue corduroy jacket that morning, a cap that said "Future Flight Captain" on it, the kind of detail that lodges in the memory and refuses to let go because it is so specific and so innocent and so entirely at odds with what was about to happen. He had $1 in his pocket money his parents had given him, so he could stop and buy himself a soda along the way, a small treat to mark the occasion of the first solo walk. He had a small bag over his shoulder. He was 6 years old and he was thrilled, in the way only a 6-year-old can be thrilled about something an adult would barely notice, because this morning, for the first time in his life, he was going to make the walk to the bus stop alone, without a parent at his side, and that fact made the whole morning feel different from every morning that had come before it. The bus stop was at the corner of West Broadway and Prince Street, a block and a half from his front door. In a neighborhood his family had lived in for years, on a route Eitan had walked dozens of times with his parents, past storefronts he recognized, and neighbors who knew his name. The distance between his apartment door and that corner was not wilderness. It was not even particularly quiet. Soho in the morning was a neighborhood turning over from night to day, people moving on the sidewalks, delivery trucks making their rounds, the city conducting its slow, loud business of simply existing. A block and a half of all of that, 500 feet, give or take, of familiar, urban morning. His mother, Julie Patz, stood at the doorway of their building and watched him go. She saw him pass Wooster Street, the first cross street on his short route, and she watched him moving away from her, small and purposeful in his blue jacket, the cap on his head. And then she went back inside. There was no reason to watch further. The stop was right there. The route was one he knew. Julie Patz went back inside with the reasonable, ordinary confidence of a parent who has just watched their child take a small and proud step toward independence, and she waited for the afternoon when he would come home and tell her how it went. Eitan never boarded the bus. The school day passed in its entirety before anyone understood what that meant. Here's the critical detail, and it is one that still carries a particular kind of institutional weight, even decades later. Eitan was absent from school all day on May 25, 1979, and no one at the school contacted his parents to report it. This was not negligence in a vacuum. This was 1979, and the systems simply did not exist. Automated attendance tracking, digital records, instant parent notification by phone or message, none of that was in place. Absence in a New York City elementary school classroom that year meant a mark in a paper register, a notation made by a teacher at the start of the day and filed without urgency. It did not mean a phone call to the family before noon. It did not mean a flag in a system that connected the absent child to the child who had never arrived at a bus stop 6 blocks away. The day moved forward, hour by hour, without anyone drawing that line. It was only when Eitan did not return home in the afternoon, when the hour at which he was supposed to come back through that door arrived and then passed, and the door stayed closed, and the apartment stayed quiet, that Julie and Stan Patz understood that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be explained by a missed bus or a forgotten phone call. This is where the case snaps from ordinary to catastrophic in a single motion. By that evening, more than 100 police officers were moving through Soho. Bloodhounds were working the route between 113 Prince Street and the bus stop at West Broadway. Noses pressed to the pavement on a path that was barely 500 feet long, a 500-foot stretch of city sidewalk, in a neighborhood that had been fully populated and alive all morning. And somewhere along it, or somewhere in its immediate vicinity, a 6-year-old boy had simply ceased to be visible to the world. The dogs worked the scent. The officers knocked on doors up and down the block and the surrounding streets. Neighbors who had been out that morning were questioned, carefully and repeatedly, about what they had seen between roughly 8 and 9 in the morning. Any child, any adult approaching a child, any vehicle that seemed wrong, any sound. Nobody had seen Eitan board the bus. Nobody had seen him approached or taken. Nobody could identify a specific moment, a specific location on that short route, a specific face, and say with any confidence, there, that is where the morning changed. The block and a half between his home and that bus stop contained the answer. And on that first night, and for a very long time afterward, it would not give it up. What followed was one of the most consequential missing persons investigations in American history, not just because of how long it ran, not just because of its legal complexity, but because of what it forced the country to change. Eitan Patz became the first missing child to appear on a milk carton in the United States. His school photograph, blonde hair, small, serious expression circulated through the country in a way that no missing child's face had ever circulated before, appearing on breakfast tables in households that had no connection to Soho, to New York City, or to the Patz family. The image became ubiquitous almost immediately and stayed that way. May 25th, the date he disappeared, was later designated National Missing Children's Day by President Ronald Reagan. The investigation around his case reshaped in fundamental ways how the country thought about child safety, how schools handled and reported attendance, how law enforcement approached and categorized the disappearance of a minor. A 6-year-old boy who simply wanted to walk to his bus stop alone became the face of a national reckoning with how poorly equipped the United States was to protect its children once they stepped outside, or to find them when they were gone. The investigation itself stretched across decades in a way that defied easy summary. In the early years, suspicion fell heavily on a man named Jose Ramos, who had a prior connection to someone in Eitan's life and whose accounts of the morning in question were contradictory and shifted under questioning. Ramos was never charged in connection with Eitan's disappearance. He was later imprisoned on unrelated charges. He remained, for years, the figure at the center of the case's most persistent, unofficial theory, never charged, never conclusively cleared. The kind of unresolved presence a long, cold case tends to accumulate when the official record cannot close around a single answer. Then, in 2012, law enforcement made a decision that briefly seemed like it might finally provide something solid. Investigators moved into a basement at 127B Prince Street, a space once associated with a handyman who had worked in the neighborhood and had access to the children living nearby. They excavated the space with heavy equipment. Media gathered outside. The city watched with the specific kind of held breath that comes from 33 years of waiting. The dig produced nothing that conclusively moved the case forward. But here's what happened next, and what makes this case unlike almost any other in the archive. In 2012, a man named Pedro Hernandez walked into a police station in New Jersey and confessed to killing Etan Patz. He said he had lured Etan into the basement of a bodega on his route to the bus stop and killed him there. He provided specific details. He was charged with murder. His first trial ended in a hung jury. A single juror refused to convict, citing serious doubts about the reliability of a confession from a man with a documented history of mental illness, given without legal counsel and partially recanted. The second trial, in 2017, ended in conviction. Pedro Hernandez was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, and yet, Etan Patz's remains have never been found. There is no physical evidence that independently corroborates Hernandez's confession, no forensic anchor tying him to the crime outside the confession itself. The legal record is settled, the conviction stands. But the physical reality of what happened to Etan, where he was taken, what was done, where he is now remains, in the most factual sense, unknown. Jose Ramos retains his complicated position in the public history of the case. The basement, at 127B, yielded nothing. The bodega is long gone. What the case leaves behind, beyond the courtrooms and the legal proceedings, is a set of images the culture has never fully let go of. A milk carton, a blue corduroy jacket, a cap that said "Future Flight Captain," a mother standing in a doorway watching her son pass Wooster Street and then going back inside, because there was no reason not to, because it was a May morning and the stop was right there and he knew the way. He knew the way and he did not make it. The next disappearance happened deep in the wilderness, where a boy only had to walk half a mile back to a cabin in terrain his family knew well, on a summer afternoon when everything should have been fine. July 10th, 1971. The Santanoni Preserve, Newcomb, Essex County, New York. To understand what happened here, and to understand why it has resisted explanation for more than 50 years, you first have to understand what the Santanoni Preserve actually is, because the name alone doesn't carry the weight of the place. This is not a park in any sense that a city person would recognize. This is not a maintained trail system with numbered markers and emergency call boxes at regular intervals and ranger stations visible from the high points. This is 12,900 acres of Adirondack backcountry bogs that can swallow a boot to the knee in a single misstep. Brush so dense in places that forward movement becomes a negotiation with the terrain rather than a simple act of walking through it. Ponds and lakes scattered through the forest in patterns that bear no particular relationship to the trails supposed to connect them. The Great Camp at Santanoni, a historic estate complex, once a wealthy family's private wilderness retreat, sits roughly 5 miles from the nearest road, accessible only on foot or by horse-drawn wagon along a single main track. The surrounding land does not forgive disorientation. It does not offer second chances to someone who takes 20 steps in the wrong direction and loses the reference point they were using to navigate. The Adirondacks have a particular quality in summer. The green is so complete, so unbroken, that the forest interior looks the same in every direction, and the sounds of people calling from 50 yards away can be absorbed and scattered by the vegetation until they reach you as something so faint you cannot tell which direction they're coming from. On the afternoon of July 10th, 1971, an 8-year-old boy named Douglas Legg walked into that landscape and did not come back out. Douglas was a few weeks away from his 9th birthday. He was described as a compact, energetic child, 4 feet 10 inches tall, blonde hair, blue eyes, the kind of kid who moved through outdoor spaces with the specific confidence of someone who had grown up around wilderness and did not have the ordinary child's hesitation about it. His family had a connection to the Santanoni estate, and the trip that July was not a first visit to unfamiliar territory. He had been there before. He knew what the camp looked like. He knew what the trails looked and felt like under his feet. He was not a child who had been dropped into a place he didn't know and was trying to navigate it cold. He was a child in a place his family had some familiarity with, on a summer afternoon, with people he knew and trusted a short distance away. What happened in the minutes before he disappeared is simple to describe and has spent 5 decades refusing to resolve into anything other than a nightmare. Douglas had gone out on a hike with his uncle and some other family members. At some point during that hike, his uncle assessed the terrain ahead and made a practical parental decision. Douglas was not properly dressed for what was coming. He wasn't wearing long pants, and the concern was poison ivy, a reasonable and ordinary concern for a summer hike in the Adirondacks. The uncle told Douglas to head back to the camp and change into something more appropriate. It was not a punishment or a complicated instruction. It was a simple redirection. Go back, change your clothes, and we'll catch up with you. The camp was approximately 150 yards behind them, roughly the length of half a football field. The uncle later reported that it was within sight of where they were standing, a straight and familiar path back to a known destination. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, Douglas turned around and started walking back toward camp. He never arrived. The family realized something was wrong when Douglas didn't appear at the camp, and then didn't appear, and then kept not appearing in a way that moved from puzzling to alarming in the specific increments that only a parent or a close family member would understand. The first 5 minutes of wondering, the next 5 of active looking, the moment when looking becomes calling, and then the moment when calling becomes something else entirely. A possible sighting was reported shortly after Douglas turned back. His brother or cousin may have seen a figure on a nearby ridge that could have been Douglas, moving in a direction that was not toward the camp. If that sighting was accurate, it suggests that Douglas, for reasons that have never been established, left the direct path back to camp and moved in a different direction. But the sighting was uncertain enough that it cannot carry the weight of a confirmed last known position with any confidence. It is one of those fragments of possible information that a search depends on in the early hours, and that complicates everything that comes after. By nightfall, the search had already begun. By the following morning, it had grown into something the Adirondacks had rarely seen. Law enforcement, conservation officers, and civilian volunteers arrived at the Santanoni Preserve in numbers that required serious logistical coordination just to move through the terrain without the searchers losing each other. Over the days and weeks that followed, the search expanded to include roughly 1,000 volunteers working in organized ground teams, dog units working scent trails through the brush and around the water edges, helicopters making passes over the canopy, and in a detail that underscores how seriously the search was taken, United States Air Force aircraft equipped with forward-looking infrared imaging technology, scanning the heat signatures of the forest floor for any sign of a living child or, later, for anything that shouldn't be there. A mountain rescue team was brought in from California, specialists in terrain-based search operations who had worked in conditions as difficult as anything the continental United States offers. They worked the Santanoni Preserve. They were defeated by it. Here's the critical detail. The search ran for an entire month. It did not close for lack of effort or lack of resources or lack of people willing to spend their days moving through 12,000-plus acres of Adirondack backcountry in the summer heat, pushing through brush that tore at clothing, wading the margins of ponds, calling a child's name into a forest that gave nothing back. It closed on August 10, 1971, 31 days after Douglas Legg walked away from his uncle on a trail that was 150 yards from a place he knew, because the searchers had covered the accessible terrain multiple times, had used every tool available to them, and had found nothing, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint that could be confirmed as his after the first rain hit the trails, not a single physical trace of a child who had been wearing identifiable clothing in a specific, bounded location on a specific afternoon. If you are new here, hit subscribe. We go this deep on every case. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that is specific to long wilderness disappearances, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment. The Santanoni terrain has a quality that search and rescue professionals who worked the case described in terms that stayed in the public record. The bogs, In particular, the Adirondack bogs in that region are not decorative features of the landscape. They are deep, cold, and in some places effectively bottomless, in any practical sense, organic material accumulated over thousands of years, compressed into a medium that can take something down and hold it with an efficiency that no deliberate concealment could improve upon. A child moving through unfamiliar terrain in a disoriented state, especially in the late afternoon when light quality in a dense forest shifts faster than most people expect, could move from firm ground to bog margin in a matter of steps. Hypothermia even in summer, in the Adirondacks, when temperatures drop sharply after sunset and a child soaked by contact with bog water loses heat far faster than the ambient air temperature would suggest, is a real factor in the leading theory about what happened to Douglas. Leg. The terrain absorbed him. That is the leading explanation, and the search results are consistent with it in the brutal, negative way that an absence of physical evidence can be consistent with a theory. The bog takes something, and it does not come back. But here's what doesn't make sense, and what has kept this case in the minds of the people who study it. 150 yards. The camp was within sight. Douglas had been there before. He had the specific, embodied knowledge of a child who has spent time in a landscape, the way familiar ground feels underfoot, the way a known landmark looks from different angles, the pull of a direction that leads home. And yet, on a July afternoon, in a time frame that the adults nearby could not even define with precision, between the moment his uncle last saw him turning back on the trail and the moment the family realized the camp had not received him, that 150 yards became an infinite distance. The camp was there. He was there. The path between them was not long and not hidden. And something happened in the space between those 2 points that no investigation, no search, and no amount of subsequent analysis has ever been able to name. The case did not close without consequence. The disappearance of Douglas Legg fundamentally reshaped how the state of New York approached wilderness search and rescue. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation developed new protocols in the years following the search protocols around how quickly a search could be activated, how searchers were coordinated and deployed into complex terrain, how available technology was integrated into active operations. The Legg case is, in the grim accounting of these things, part of the foundation on which better systems were eventually built. That is the kind of legacy a case like this leaves. Not resolution, but institutional change, driven by the specific shape of the failure. In 2012, a set of bones was found in the Santanoni Preserve area. The discovery generated the specific, awful attention that any find in that landscape would generate after 50 years of nothing. Testing was conducted. The bones were animal. The case remained open. The family sold the estate property not long after the search closed. The lodge is still there, preserved now as a historic site. The trails are still there, maintained to the degree that remote Adirondack trails are ever maintained. The bog is still there. Douglas Legg would be in his early 60s now. The great camp at Santanoni looks completely normal in the afternoon light. So does the trail that runs back toward camp from the place where his uncle last saw him turning around, 150 yards from somewhere safe, on a summer afternoon in 1971. The next person also walked into the wilderness, but he was 19 years old, experienced, and told his friends exactly where he was going. April 12, 1976. Mount Marcy, Essex County, New York. The highest point in the state, 5,343 feet above sea level. A summit that sits above the tree line and offers, on a clear day, a view of the surrounding high peaks that makes the climb feel entirely worth the effort. Hikers have been summiting Marcy for well over a century. The trails are documented, the route is known, and the mountain has a long enough history of human traffic that it carries the specific confidence of a place people go regularly and return from without incident. It is not a technical climb. It does not require specialized equipment or mountaineering experience. On a good day in late spring or early summer, with dry trails and stable weather, it is an ambitious but achievable day hike for a reasonably fit person who knows what they're doing and has paid attention to the forecast. It is the kind of mountain that experienced hikers can underestimate, precisely because it is New York's highest point, and not something more dramatic sounding. A mountain with an impressive title and a reputation for being accessible, which occasionally causes people to forget that accessible and safe are not the same thing when the conditions change. April is not a good month on Mount Marcy. That is the first thing to understand about what happened here. April in the high peaks means snow, not the postcard kind, but the wet, heavy, trail-obscuring kind that buries cairns and blaze marks and turns familiar routes into exercises in guesswork. It means ice on the exposed upper sections where the wind has had time to work at the moisture. It means temperatures at the summit that can drop to 10 degrees Fahrenheit or below when the wind picks up, and wind that does not stay politely at a reasonable speed, the kind of wind that hits the exposed ridgeline at 40, 50, 60 miles per hour and removes from the environment any comfortable margin for error. April on Marcy has a specific quality that experienced hikers know and that less experienced ones sometimes discover too late. The mountain looks manageable from the trailhead and reveals itself to be something else entirely. By the time you're above the tree line and the wind has found you and the light is starting to shift toward late afternoon. On April 12, 1976, a 19-year-old named Stephen Paul Thomas was somewhere on that mountain, alone, in exactly those conditions. Stephen had come on the trip somewhat last minute, invited by a childhood friend to join a group heading into the high peaks for a spring hike. He was 19, quiet in the way some young men are quiet at that age, carrying something interior that he hadn't fully opened up about to the people around him. His companions would later recall that he had seemed somewhat withdrawn in the days before the hike, and there had apparently been some private conversation about a trip he was planning to make out west, a detail that would become significant later, or at least would be made to seem significant by people looking for explanations in a case that refused to offer any clean ones. He was not, by the accounts available, an experienced mountaineer. He was a 19-year-old who had said yes to a hike on New York's highest peak in April with a group of friends, which is the kind of decision that seems entirely reasonable at 19 and looks different in retrospect. The group made their way up toward the summit through the morning and into the early afternoon. By the time they reached a lean-to shelter, located approximately 1 mile below the summit, the conditions were already doing what April conditions on Marcy do. The temperature was dropping, the wind was building, and the wet cold of the high elevation was working its way through whatever layers a person was wearing and making the idea of pushing further toward the exposed summit feel less appealing than it had at the trailhead. The group stopped at the lean-to. They made tea. They rested. Stephen dropped his pack against the shelter wall and sat with the others in the relative protection of the lean-to's 3 walls and roof. And for a short time, the group simply existed in that space together, warming themselves with the tea and the temporary relief from the wind. Then Stephen stood up. He had made a decision. He was going to walk up the trail, just up the trail, he told his companion Weaver, just to see a bit more of the mountain. He left his pack in the lean-to. He left his gear. He walked out of the shelter and up the trail toward the summit, carrying nothing substantial against the cold and the wind that were actively building on the mountain above him. And that is the last confirmed time anyone saw Stephen Paul Thomas. Here's what happened next. And this is where the case moves from a sad story into something that has stayed with search and rescue professionals and the people who study these cases for decades. When Stephen didn't come back to the lean-to in a reasonable time, and the light started dropping, and the temperature with it, and the wind on the mountain climbed to roughly 60 miles per hour, and the temperature at elevation fell toward 10 degrees, the group faced a decision. The decision they made was to search for Stephen themselves, rather than to get down off the mountain and alert the rangers. This is not a judgment, it is a description of what happened and why it matters. They spent that night calling into the dark, into a wind that was loud enough to swallow a human voice in seconds, into a landscape that in the dark and in those conditions had become something genuinely hostile. A dog that had come with the group reportedly behaved in a way that unnerved everyone in the lean-to throughout that night. Agitated, reactive, unwilling to settle, the group held on until dawn. When morning came, they descended and reported Stephen missing to the authorities. The delay the night spent on the mountain searching, rather than getting help, meant that the organized institutional response began not in the hours after Stephen walked away from the lean-to, but roughly 18 hours. Later, after a night of exposure had done whatever it had done to the trail evidence, to any tracks Stephen might have left in the snow, to any physical trace of the direction he had moved in after leaving the shelter. Now this is where the case turns dark in a very specific way. The search that followed was exhaustive in a way that the terrain made genuinely punishing. State police, Department of Environmental Conservation Rangers, and military helicopter units made 32 documented trips into the Mount Marcy area over the 2 weeks following Stephen's disappearance. 32. On foot, by air, working the summit, working the ridgelines, working the specific terrain feature that sits to the east of the summit and that experienced guides identify as one of the most dangerous disorientation traps on the mountain, Panther Gorge. The gorge sits in a leeward position relative to the prevailing winds, which means that a disoriented hiker moving downwind from the summit in low visibility could move toward it without understanding what they were moving toward until the terrain committed them to a direction that offered no safe return. It is the kind of feature that appears on maps as a name and a contour line and reveals itself in person as something that swallows what enters it. The searchers knew to look there. They looked. They found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a boot print, confirmed as Stephen's, not a discarded item, not a fragment of anything that a 19-year-old carrying nothing into a 60-mile-per-hour wind in 10-degree cold would have left on his way from the lean-to to wherever he ended up. The mountain, over 32 trips and 2 weeks of sustained searching, yielded nothing that could be confirmed as belonging to Stephen Paul Thomas or indicating the direction he had traveled. Here's the critical detail, and it is one that the search record reflects with a particular kind of honesty. During those searches, working the terrain around Mount Marcy in the deep snow of April 1976, the searchers found human remains. They found them in an area they had been working, in terrain that the snow had been concealing from previous passes. The remains were those of a hiker named Atkinson, who had been lost in the same region in 1973, 3 years before Stephen went missing, and whose disappearance had similarly gone unresolved. The searchers looking for Stephen Thomas walked over the place where Atkinson had been lying for 3 years without knowing it until the specific conditions of that April let them see what had been there all along. It is the kind of detail that does not improve the case in any direction. It simply expands the darkness, offering proof that the mountain keeps what it takes and releases it on its own terms, in its own time, or not at all. Stephen's brother Bob has not stopped. That is the thread in this case that sits apart from the institutional record and carries its own particular weight. Bob Thomas has made more than 600 summit climbs on Mount Marcy in the decades since his brother disappeared, searching, returning, going back. He has covered an estimated 2,500 miles of high peaks terrain looking for any physical trace of Stephen. 32 official search trips over 2 weeks in 1976. Then one man, 600 climbs, over decades, going back again and again to a mountain that has never answered him. That is not a detail from an investigation file. That is something else entirely, the human cost of an impossible gap made visible in a single life, in a pair of boots that have crossed that summit more times than most people will cross any threshold they love. But here's what doesn't make sense, and what the case keeps returning to. Stephen left his pack. He left his gear. He walked out of a shelter carrying almost nothing into conditions that were already at the edge of survivable, in a direction that only one person saw him take, on the highest mountain in New York. He told his companion he was just going to walk up the trail. That is the last thing he said. And whether that statement was a simple statement of intention from a young man who misjudged the conditions, or whether it was something else, an exit, a decision made quietly while the tea was still warm and the others were looking at something else, the mountain has never said. The theory of intentional disappearance has been discussed, labeled clearly as a theory, and it remains exactly that. The leading explanation is exposure. The conditions were lethal and Stephen had nothing to fight them with. But the absence of any physical trace, across 32 formal searches and 600 informal ones, has kept the case from settling into a single clean answer. Somewhere on Mount Marcy, there is likely an answer. The mountain has offered nothing in 50 years. The next case does not happen in wilderness. It happens on a well-lit street where 3 separate witnesses watched a young woman walk and then watched her vanish anyway. March 27th, 1985. Colony, New York. A suburb of Albany, the kind of place that exists at the functional edge of a mid-sized city. Strip malls and arterial roads, parking lots that empty out after dark, the specific geography of a place designed for cars rather than pedestrians, where the distances between one destination and the next feel manageable in a vehicle, and expose themselves as something different the moment you step out onto the sidewalk and start walking. Central Avenue is the main commercial spine of Colony, a road that runs long and wide through a landscape of fast food, gas stations, nail salons, and the kind of small service businesses that cluster along high-traffic corridors and depend on drive-by visibility rather than foot traffic. It is not a neighborhood in any residential sense. It is a commercial strip, functional and bright during business hours, and noticeably less inhabited once the evening settles in and the traffic thins and the parking lots start to show more empty asphalt than occupied spaces. The kind of road where a person walking alone after dark is not invisible exactly, but is alone in a way that feels different from being alone on a busy sidewalk in a dense city, more exposed, more isolated by the specific design of the place, which was never built with the pedestrian in mind. A 22-year-old named Karen Louise Wilson was walking along that road on the evening of March 27, 1985, and she had every reason to believe she was going to make it home. Karen was a senior at the State University of New York at Albany, studying political science, close enough to finishing her degree that the end was not an abstraction, but an actual visible point on a near horizon. She was the kind of student who had assembled a full life around her coursework friends on campus, plans beyond graduation, a social world that her suitemates and classmates were embedded in with her. She was preparing for a spring break trip to Fort Lauderdale. She had already bought the t-shirts, already made the plans, already moved in her mind toward the warmth and looseness of a week away from coursework and the gray Albany winter that had been running long and cold. There is something specific about that detail: the t-shirts already purchased, the trip already planned, that makes the ordinary texture of her final day feel particularly sharp in retrospect. She was not living as though anything was about to change. She had things to look forward to. She had a return date built into her calendar. She had spent part of that Wednesday afternoon on Central Avenue doing what she needed to do: running errands, tanning at the tanning hut at 1670 Central Avenue, taking care of the ordinary logistical business of a young woman with a full schedule and an upcoming trip she was looking forward to. At approximately 7:20 in the evening, she left the tanning hut. The evening was cold in the specific way that upstate New York evenings in late March are cold winter, not fully finished. The warmth of the day already retreating by 7 o'clock. The kind of dark that settles fast once the sun is gone, because there is nothing in the flat commercial landscape to hold the light. She was heading back to the State University of New York Albany campus, where her dorm was waiting, where her suitemates were, where the rest of the evening was presumably going to be unremarkable, in all the ways most evenings are unremarkable. She knew the route. She had made it before. She never arrived. The route from the tanning hut back to the State University of New York Albany campus runs south along Fuller Road, crossing through a stretch of terrain that the gap between its name and its actual character makes worth pausing on. Fuller Road at that point passes the 6-mile waterworks area, also known as Rensselaer Lake, a reservoir property with significant tree cover and a road shoulder that narrows and darkens in the absence of adequate streetlights. The waterworks area has a quality that daytime photographs do not fully capture. After dark, the tree cover closes the sky above the road. The reservoir sits just beyond the tree line on one side, and the ambient light from Central Avenue's commercial strip fades quickly the farther south you walk. It runs adjacent to the Interstate 90 westbound on-ramp, a piece of highway infrastructure that generates a particular kind of darkness after the interchange itself, the kind of spot where the road curves toward the highway and the pedestrian infrastructure simply stops, because the assumption baked into the design is that nobody is walking here. That assumption is the architecture of the problem. The stretch between the tanning salon on Central Avenue and the State University of New York campus is not a long walk in terms of miles, but it passes through terrain that a pedestrian navigates by accepting a series of lighting and visibility conditions that deteriorate the farther south along Fuller Road they travel. until the on-ramp itself represents a moment of near total exposure, a person alone at the edge of a highway, in the dark, with no infrastructure around them that was ever designed with their safety in mind. 3 independent witnesses saw Karen Wilson walking south on Fuller Road that evening, in the vicinity of the 6 Mile Waterworks area and the Interstate 90 on-ramp. All 3 accounts were consistent in the basic geography. She was heading in the direction of campus, moving along the road on foot in the dark. In the time window between roughly 8:10 and 8:20 in the evening, the witnesses did not know each other. They were not traveling together or comparing notes in real time. They simply each saw the same young woman at roughly the same stretch of road, in roughly the same short window, moving in a direction that was toward the campus and away from the commercial strip behind her. The final confirmed sighting placed her near the intersection of Washington Avenue and Fuller Road at approximately 8:20 in the evening, still walking, still moving in the direction she needed to go, still alive and visible and in motion, roughly 50 minutes after she had left the tanning salon. And that is the last confirmed time anyone saw Karen Wilson. Here's what doesn't make sense, and what makes this case specifically and persistently disturbing, rather than simply tragic. The witnesses were there. 3 separate people, independent of each other, who had no particular reason to pay unusual attention to a young woman walking south on Fuller Road, but who nonetheless noticed her well enough to report the sighting afterward with meaningful consistency. 3 sets of eyes on the same person, on the same road, in approximately the same time frame. And yet none of them saw what came next. None of them saw an approach, a vehicle, a confrontation, a moment at which Karen's walk was interrupted by anything or anyone. The last witness placed her at a specific intersection at a specific time, walking, moving, normal. And then the case moves from that sighting into a silence so complete it is almost architectural. She was there. She was heading in the right direction. The campus was not far. And somewhere in the dark stretch between the last confirmed sighting and the dorm room she never entered that night, in a matter of what investigators later assessed could have been seconds in the right or wrong set of circumstances, Karen Louise Wilson was gone. One of the witness accounts included a detail that has stayed attached to the case in the years since: a slow-moving car in the vicinity of where Karen was walking, driven by a white male who was described as having what the witness characterized as an intent look. That description is not a clean evidentiary thread. It is the kind of detail that a witness produces from a brief, partial observation under poor lighting conditions, filtered through whatever framework of concern or retrospective knowledge the witness brings to the account when they're asked to recall it. It is meaningful enough to have anchored part of the investigation, not reliable enough to have resolved it. A composite sketch was produced from witness descriptions and circulated through law enforcement channels in the Albany area. The sketch generated leads. None of those leads closed the case. No identification was ever made that connected a specific individual to what happened on Fuller Road on the night of March 27th. Karen's belongings were never found. There was no wallet recovered from a ditch. No piece of clothing snagged on a fence along Fuller Road. No item in any searched location that placed her at a specific point after that 8:20 sighting. The absence of physical evidence in a case like this is its own kind of statement. It means either that she was moved quickly and completely from the scene of whatever happened, or that whatever happened occurred at a location that searching teams were never able to identify with enough precision to find the physical record. The campus she had walked toward thousands of times during her years at the State University of New York, Albany, simply never received her on the night of March 27th. Her dorm room, her suite mates, her spring break clothes and her Fort Lauderdale plans and the remainder of her senior year, all of it sat waiting for her on the other side of a distance she never crossed. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that reaches forward through time. Investigators looking at the details of Karen Wilson's disappearance, the timing, the route, the Fuller Road corridor, the proximity to the State University of New York Albany campus, the profile of a young woman walking alone after dark on a road that was not designed for pedestrians, would eventually find themselves looking at those same details again, 13 years later, in connection with a different missing student from the same university. The parallel is not a conspiracy or a confirmed connection. It has been investigated, and the investigation has not produced a documented link between the two cases. But the geography is what it is, and the pattern is what it is. And the fact that two young women associated with the State University of New York, Albany, disappeared under circumstances that share enough surface features to demand comparison is something the public record has noted without being able to resolve. We will get to that second case. The corridor will come back. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. We cover them every week. In the years following Karen's disappearance, the unidentified man described near the on-ramp remained the clearest potential thread in the investigation, and the clearest example of how little the investigation ultimately had to anchor itself to. A possible suspect entered the peripheral attention of investigators years later and died in a house fire in 2013 before any formal link to the disappearance could be established or conclusively ruled out. That is how these things sometimes end, not with resolution, but with the closing of a door that was never fully opened in the first place. The potential connection was never confirmed. The case remained open. Karen Wilson's name remained on the New York State Missing Persons Registry, attached to a last known location on a road that her campus was just visible from on a clear day, if you stood at the right angle and the light was right. Here's the critical detail that tends to be underweighted when people encounter this case. Through summary, Karen Wilson was 50 minutes into a walk she had made many times before, in a city she had lived in for years, heading toward a destination she knew well, watched by 3 separate witnesses on a Wednesday evening in March 1985. And none of that was sufficient. The familiarity of the route, the presence of witnesses, the fact that the campus was close, none of it was sufficient. That is the specific, quiet dread at the center of this case. Safety is not a function of how well you know a place or how many people can see you from a distance. It is not guaranteed by proximity to a destination or by the ordinary confidence of someone who has walked the same route 100 times without incident. Karen Wilson knew that road. She had walked it before. The witnesses could see her, and it still happened in a matter of seconds, on a stretch of road designed for cars, in the dark, where the infrastructure of the place provided no shelter and no protection, and no one close enough to intervene in whatever happened in the gap between the last sighting and the silence that followed. She would have graduated that spring. Fort Lauderdale was planned. The t-shirts were already bought. Her name appears on the New York State Missing Persons records to this day, alongside a last known location that is just a road, Fuller Road, heading south, in the dark, 50 minutes from where she started. 13 years later, another State University of New York Albany student would vanish steps from her dorm as if the campus had a pattern. March 2nd, 1998, the State University of New York at Albany. 13 years after Karen Wilson walked south on Fuller Road and disappeared into a silence that has never broken. Another young woman associated with the same university was making her way back to the same campus on a Monday night in early March. The weather was cold in the specific, unremarkable way that early March in Albany is always cold, not dramatically so, not a storm or an emergency, just the ordinary gray chill of an upstate New York winter that has gone on long enough that everyone in it has stopped remarking on it and simply moved through it with their coats zipped and their heads down. The campus itself was not deserted. A Monday evening at a major state university generates its own particular kind of low-level activity. Students moving between buildings, the library still lit, people walking back from dining halls and study sessions and part-time jobs in the community. The normal circulatory movement of a large residential campus that doesn't fully stop between dinner and midnight. A young woman walking from a bus stop to her dorm on that kind of evening, at that kind of campus, in that kind of weather, was doing something so unremarkable that it would not have drawn a second glance from anyone who saw her. She was simply going home. Her name was Suzanne Gloria Lyle. She was 19 years old. Suzanne was a computer science major, not just studying it in the passive sense, but genuinely fluent in it, in a way that stood out even among her peers. She built personal computers from scratch. She understood the architecture of the machines at a level that most of her classmates were still working toward. She was quiet in the way that people who have strong interior lives are often quiet, not withdrawn, not troubled in any way her friends and suitemates identified as a concern, but self-contained, moving through her days with a focused competence that made her seem older than 19, in the best possible sense. She was a Rush fan. She wrote poetry. She was not, by any account available in the record, a person who took unnecessary risks or who moved through the world carelessly. She was a 19-year-old who knew exactly what she was doing and where she was going, almost all of the time. On the evening of March 2nd, Suzanne finished her shift at Babbage's, a computer and video game retail store in Crossgates Mall, the large shopping complex in the suburb of Westmere, several miles west of the State University of New York at Albany campus. The store had closed for the evening, and Suzanne left the mall at approximately 9:20 in the evening and made her way to the bus stop to catch the CDTA city bus that would carry her back to campus, the same route she had taken many times before. The same reliable connection between her part-time job and her dorm room that had been a fixed feature of her weekly routine for long enough that it required no particular thought or planning. She knew the bus. She knew the stop. She knew the campus end of the route and the short walk from the bus stop to her building. She boarded the bus. The driver later recalled her as a passenger on the route that evening, though the specific details of what the driver did and did not observe have been characterized differently in different accounts of the case, and the precise evidentiary weight of the driver's recollection became one of the points the investigation returned to repeatedly without fully resolving. The bus arrived at the State University of New York at Albany Uptown campus. It stopped at Collins Circle, a transit hub at the edge of the campus that serves as the primary drop-off and pickup point for students using the city bus system to move between the university and the surrounding community. Collins Circle is not isolated. It is a functional, campus-facing transit node in a location that sees regular student foot traffic, with campus buildings visible from the stop and a walk to the residential areas that is measured in minutes rather than in distance that requires any particular navigation. A classmate of Suzanne's later reported seeing her get off the bus at Collins Circle at approximately 9:45 in the evening. That account, a classmate, recognizing a familiar face in the ordinary business of a Monday night on campus, is the last confirmed sighting of Suzanne Gloria Lyle. She never reached her dorm. Here's the critical detail. Her suitemates had a specific, involuntary way of knowing when Suzanne came home. Her keys. The particular sound of her keys in the lock, a sound they had heard hundreds of times. Distinctive enough that they had come to recognize it without consciously registering that they were listening for it. On the night of March 2nd, the keys never sounded. The door never opened. The room where Suzanne's glasses were sitting on a surface, where her hairdryer was plugged in, where her belongings were arranged in the specific geography of someone who fully intended to return that room, stayed quiet. Her boyfriend attempted to reach her by phone that evening. The calls went unanswered. The suitemates went to sleep and assumed whatever they assumed, and woke up and the room was still quiet. When the disappearance was reported to university authorities, the initial response was characterized, in the public record that followed, as reflecting an institutional assumption that a young adult not returning to her dorm overnight was not uncommon and did not necessarily require immediate aggressive action. That assumption cost hours. The specific number of hours lost to the gap between when the concern was first raised and when a full missing persons response was activated has been documented and discussed in the context of the case's aftermath, because the aftermath included something concrete and significant. Suzanne's mother, Debbie Lyle, did not accept the pace of the official response and began advocating immediately and publicly for her daughter with an intensity that eventually changed state law. The legislation that came to be known as Suzanne's Law, enacted in 2003 and incorporated into federal law as part of the Amber Alert system, requires law enforcement to immediately enter a missing person between the ages of 18 and 21 into the national database without the waiting period that had applied to adults in that age range. No 24-hour wait. Immediate entry. Suzanne Lyle's name and the specific hours lost at the beginning of her case is embedded in the law that now governs how cases like hers are handled. She has not been found, but she changed the system. The investigation that eventually assembled around her disappearance generated over 270 documented leads. Searchers covered 300 acres of terrain in and around the campus. Every person who had been on that bus, every person who had been at Collins Circle that evening, every person whose path might have intersected with Suzanne's between 9:45 in the evening and wherever the trail ended, all of it was worked through a process that was extensive and produced almost nothing that closed around a single explanation. Now, this is where the case turns dark in a very specific way, and it involves a detail that the investigation returned to repeatedly without resolution. The day after Suzanne disappeared, a withdrawal was made from her bank account at a Stewart's convenience store, ATM, an amount small enough to be unremarkable in isolation, but significant in context because of what it implied. Someone had accessed her account, someone had her card, or her card number. And here's the detail that the investigation could not get past: someone had her PIN. The PIN was not written down in a recoverable location. It was not a number that could be easily guessed from publicly available information about Suzanne. The people in her immediate life who could have known the PIN were a very short list, and that list was examined carefully. No arrest was ever made in connection with the ATM withdrawal. The identity of who made that transaction, whether it was Suzanne herself, or someone who had her card and her PIN, or someone who had obtained that information through some circumstance, the investigation was never able to reconstruct, remains officially unknown. Weeks after Suzanne's disappearance, her student identification card was found on the State University of New York at Albany campus. Not off campus, not at a remote location, not in a place that pointed clearly toward a direction or a route or a specific event. On campus. In a location that the investigation documented without being able to explain in terms of how it got there or what it meant about where Suzanne had gone, the identification card did not advance the case. It simply reappeared, offering the illusion of a clue in a case that had very few, and then sitting in the record as another unanswered question. The investigation surfaced a person of interest in 2005, a man named John Regan, who was connected by investigators to a pattern of behavior that was considered relevant to the case. His name entered the public record in connection with the disappearance. He was never charged in connection with Suzanne's case. The specific nature of the connection that investigators were examining has been reported in various ways in local coverage and has not been resolved into a confirmed evidentiary link. It is a thread the investigation pulled on and did not find the end of. But here's what doesn't make sense. In the specific way that cases built on near misses never fully make sense. Collins Circle is not a dark road at the edge of the city. It is a campus transit hub. The bus stop exists because students use it regularly, because it connects a major university to the surrounding community in a way that requires regular, predictable pedestrian traffic. A classmate saw Suzanne get off the bus. The dorm was a short walk from where she stepped off. She had made that walk before. She had her keys in her hand, or close to her hand, the keys her suite mates had learned to hear in the lock. She was 19 years old and she was almost home, and she never got there. The parallel to Karen Wilson's case, 13 years earlier, is something investigators explored without arriving at a confirmed connection. The geography is different in its specifics, but consistent in its structure. A State University of New York at Albany student, a route from an off-campus location back to the campus, a short distance between the last confirmed sighting and a destination that was never reached. The Fuller Road corridor of 1985 and the Collins Circle bus stop of 1998 are not the same place, but they are the same shape. Two young women, the same university. The same short distance between last seen and never arrived. The same silence on the other side of it. Suzanne's glasses are still sitting in the record of her room, described in the accounts of those first days after she disappeared. Her hairdryer. The ordinary objects of an ordinary dorm room belonging to a 19-year-old who was coming home. The bus stop at Collins Circle is still on the State University of New York at Albany campus. The route from that stop to her dormitory is still exactly as short as it was on the night of March 2nd, 1998. The distance has not grown. The answer has not arrived. The next case moves from a campus to a different kind of dark, a fog-blind highway in Greene County, driven by a woman who had just gotten a raise and had a doctor's appointment the next morning. August 29th, 2002, Greene County, New York. The Catskill region sits at the edge of what most people picture when they think of upstate New York, not the high peaks drama of the Adirondacks to the north, but something quieter and in its own way more disorienting, a landscape of rolling forested ridges and small river valleys where the roads run along creek beds and the hills press close on both sides. and the distances between one town and the next feel longer at night than they do on a map. The town of Catskill itself sits on the western bank of the Hudson River in Greene County, a small city that once had the specific, faded grandeur quality of a place that was important 100 years ago and has been quietly adjusting to a different kind of importance since. State Route 23 runs west from Catskill through the Jefferson Heights area and then continues into the interior of Greene County, climbing into the hills, narrowing as it goes, becoming the kind of road that feels entirely manageable in daylight and reveals itself to be something else after dark, a two-lane route through a landscape that doesn't offer much in the way of ambient light once you've left the last commercial cluster behind, where the trees close in from both sides and the fog that comes off the valleys in late summer can reduce visibility to something that requires genuine attention and slows even confident drivers to a careful crawl. On the night of August 29th, Audrey Mae Herron drove west on Route 23 and was never seen again. Audrey was 31 years old. She worked part-time as a nurse at a Columbia Green facility in the Catskill area, the kind of essential, unglamorous, physically demanding work that gets done by people who are genuinely committed to it. People who show up for overnight shifts and late closings and holiday coverage without making it a statement about themselves. She was, by every account available in the record, a woman whose life was organized around things that mattered to her in concrete, immediate ways. Her 3 children, her household, the specific rhythms of a working family life in a small community. She had recently received a raise, a detail that sits in the record as a marker of normalcy, of a life moving in the right direction, of someone whose near-term future was taking a shape they could feel good about. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled for the following morning. She had things to do. She had a reason to be home, and a reason to be there by a specific time. She clocked out of her shift at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening. Her car, a black 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee, New York license plate X233UV, was in the lot where she'd left it. She got in, pulled out onto State Route 23 heading west, and began the drive she had made many times before. The 12 to 15 miles from the facility in Catskill to her home in Freehold, a small community in the interior of Greene County. The drive would have taken her through the Jefferson Heights area, through the specific quality of late August darkness that settles on that road after 11 at night, the fog that comes up from the valley floors, the tree cover that closes the shoulder, the stretches where the road curves without warning, and the headlights sweep across nothing but vegetation and then curve back to reveal more of the same. It was not a dramatic drive. It was a known drive. She had done it before in exactly these conditions. It was the drive home. She never arrived. Her husband, waiting for her return, moved through the increments of concern that a late spouse produces the first half hour. The first hour, the point at which the phone calls go unanswered in a way that stops feeling like a dead battery and starts feeling like something else. At 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 hours after Audrey had left her shift, he reported her missing to law enforcement. What followed was a missing persons investigation that escalated quickly to a homicide investigation, not because any evidence of violence had been found, but because the specifics of the disappearance pointed in a direction that the absence of accident evidence could not explain away. There was no reported accident on Route 23 that night. No vehicle had gone through a guardrail. No call had come in from a motorist who had seen something wrong on the shoulder of the road. Audrey Herron had left a building, gotten into an identifiable vehicle, and driven onto a state highway, and then both she and the vehicle had ceased to be traceable by any means available to investigators. Here's the critical detail, and it is one that has defined this case in the 20-plus years since. The car has never been found. Not Audrey the car. A black 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee is not a small object. It is not something that can be tucked into an overgrown ditch and overlooked by a routine road survey. It is a full-sized SUV that displaces a significant volume of space wherever it comes to rest. And yet, on a 12 to 15-mile stretch of known road in Greene County, New York, that vehicle has not been located despite searches that have included aerial surveys, ground teams working the road corridor and the surrounding terrain, and in a detail that underscores how seriously investigators have continued to treat this case 2 decades later. Sonar and dive operations in the ponds and waterways along and adjacent to the route. In 2016, investigators drained and excavated a pond in the area, a decision that requires significant resources and reflects a specific theory about where the vehicle might have ended up. The pond yielded nothing. In 2022, the New York State Police partnered with the dive team from Adventures with Purpose, an organization that has located submerged vehicles and remains in cold cases across the country to conduct underwater searches in water. Bodies along and near the route Audrey would have taken. Those searches found nothing connected to her case. The vehicle remains unlocated. The question of where it went and how it went there is unanswered. Now this is where the case turns dark in the specific way that investigations with no physical anchor tend to. The attention of law enforcement turned, as it must in cases like this, toward the people closest to the missing person. Audrey's husband was characterized in various accounts of the investigation as having been uncooperative with investigators in the early stages. He has disputed that characterization publicly, citing the fact that he submitted to a polygraph examination and allowed investigators to search his property on multiple occasions, 3 searches, by some accounts, without producing anything that connected him to her disappearance. The friction between the family's account of the investigation and the investigative record is one of those features of long, cold cases that generates more heat than light without resolving anything. What is in the record is that no suspect has ever been named, no arrest has ever been made, and the investigation remains officially open as a homicide investigation, which means that investigators believe Audrey Herron did not disappear by accident or by her own choice, but that no one has been charged with anything. Here's what doesn't make sense across any of the theories the case has generated: the raise, the appointment, the children. Audrey Herron had received a raise. She had a doctor's appointment the next morning. She had 3 children who were at home waiting for her to come back, in the specific way that children wait for a parent who is coming home from a night shift, not dramatically, not consciously in some cases, but in the way that the household is simply incomplete in a specific and familiar way until the car pulls in and the door opens. None of those details are consistent with a voluntary disappearance, with a person who has decided, in the 11 o'clock darkness of Route 23, to become someone else entirely and leave behind everything their life is organized around. The theory of voluntary flight has been considered and has been weighed against the specific texture of Audrey Herron's life in August 2002, and it does not hold its shape. The investigation does not treat it as the primary framework. What the investigation treats as the primary framework that something happened to Audrey on or near Route 23 on the night of August 29th, something deliberate, something that involved the concealment of both her and her vehicle, requires either a specific person who has not been identified or an accident scenario, so complete and so precisely calibrated that it removed all evidence of itself from a road that was searched extensively. Neither of those possibilities has been resolved. Both of them require the vehicle to be somewhere. After 20+ years of searching, no one has been able to say where. The fog on Route 23 in late August is a real, documented meteorological feature of that valley terrain, not a dramatic detail imported from somewhere else, but a genuine condition that Greene County residents know and drive through and adjust to as a feature of living in that landscape. On the night of August 29, 2002, Audrey Herron drove into it at 11 o'clock in the evening, heading home, with a raise behind her and an appointment ahead and a family waiting in Freehold. The road that runs west from Catskill through Jefferson Heights toward the interior of Greene County looks, in daylight, entirely unremarkable. A functional 2-lane state highway through forested terrain, the kind of road that appears on maps as a thin line and on the ground as something you drive without thinking about it. At 11 at night, in late August, with the fog moving up from the valley floors and the trees pressing the shoulders and the ambient light from the commercial district already faded to nothing in the rearview mirror, it is a different proposition. It is the kind of road that asks something of the driver, that requires a specific quality of attention, that does not forgive a moment of something going wrong. Something went wrong. The investigation believes that. The investigation has not been able to say what or who made it happen, or where Audrey Herron and her black Jeep Grand Cherokee came to rest on the night they stopped moving forward. The road still runs west from Catskill. The valley fog still comes up in late summer. The drive is 12 to 15 miles, a number that sounds small and contained and manageable, the kind of distance you cover without marking its passing. Audrey Herron has not been found. The car has not been found. The case is open. The next disappearance happened on a night the whole world remembers, the night before September 11th. September 10, 2001. Lower Manhattan, New York City. To talk about this case honestly requires holding two things in tension simultaneously: the disappearance of a specific person with a specific life and a specific set of circumstances, and the fact that the night she disappeared was the last ordinary night the city she lived in would ever have. The two things are not the same thing, and collapsing one into the other does a disservice to both. But they cannot be fully separated either, because the event that began the following morning at 8:46 in the morning is inseparable from what the investigation into her disappearance became, and from the legal conclusion it eventually reached, and from the specific impossibility of ever knowing with certainty what happened to a woman who walked out of her life on the last night before everything changed. The city was itself the next morning, then it wasn't, and the investigation into where Sneha Ann Phillip went was conducted in the wreckage of that transformation, which shaped everything it found and everything it couldn't find, and every conclusion it was eventually forced to reach. Sneha Ann Phillip was 31 years old. She was a physician, trained, licensed, working in the field she had spent years preparing for. She lived in Lower Manhattan with her husband, in an apartment that was within walking distance of the World Trade Center complex. By the accounts available in the public record, the period leading up to her disappearance had been complicated in ways that the investigation would later examine carefully. There had been professional difficulties, a suspension from her medical position, related to circumstances that various accounts have characterized differently, and that the investigation considered as context without resolving into a single explanatory narrative. Her marriage, by some accounts, was under strain. These details exist in the record not as conclusions, but as the kind of background texture that investigators work through when trying to understand why a person was where they were and what state of mind they might have been in. They do not explain what happened to her. They frame the difficulty of explaining it. On the evening of September 10th, 2001, Sneha Ann Phillip left her apartment and went shopping. She visited department stores in Lower Manhattan, the kind of practical, unremarkable errand that a person runs without any particular sense that the evening will be significant, that the purchases being considered will ever matter to anyone beyond the person making them. She was captured on department store surveillance footage that evening, footage that was identified and analyzed as part of the investigation into her disappearance, and that placed her, with documentary certainty, in a specific location in Lower Manhattan on the night of September 10th. The footage showed her conducting the ordinary business of a person in a store, moving through the space in the way people move through retail spaces, looking, considering, existing in the unremarkable present tense of a Monday evening in a city that was, at that moment, still entirely itself. That surveillance footage is the last confirmed documentation of Sneha Ann Phillip. She did not come home that night. Her husband reported her missing on September 12th, a date that carries its own weight, because September 12th in Lower Manhattan was not a day on which the mechanisms of ordinary life were functioning in the way they normally function. The missing persons system in New York City on September 12th, 2001, was not processing the kind of case that Sneha Phillip's disappearance would have represented on any other Wednesday in any other year. It was processing the largest single-day mass casualty event in American history. The hospitals were on emergency footing. The police department was operating in a mode that had no peacetime precedent. The phone lines and intake systems that handle missing persons reports were being overwhelmed by calls from people looking for family members who had been in or near the Twin Towers when the planes hit and the buildings fell. Into that environment, on that day, a report about a physician who had not come home the night before landed in a system that was, by any honest accounting, not positioned to give it the immediate focused attention it would have received on September 12th of any other year. Here's the critical detail, and it is the one the investigation and the courts ultimately had to wrestle with most directly. There is a possible sighting of Sneha Phillip at her apartment building lobby at 8:43 in the morning on September 11th, 3 minutes before American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning. The lobby camera captured a figure that investigators and her family have identified as potentially being Sneha. The identification is not conclusive. The image quality and the specific characteristics of the figure in the lobby footage did not allow for the kind of definitive confirmation that would have settled the question of whether she was alive and in her building at 8:43 in the morning on September 11th, 3 minutes before the event that would reshape the investigative landscape around her disappearance entirely. It is a maybe. It is a silhouette at the edge of the record, pointing in a direction that cannot be confirmed and cannot be dismissed. If the lobby sighting was Sneha, she was alive at 8:43 in the morning on September 11th, 3 minutes before the first impact, in a building that was within walking distance of the World Trade Center complex. What happened to her in the minutes and hours after that, if it was her, was consumed by an event that made the physical record of Lower Manhattan that morning nearly impossible to reconstruct in the ordinary way investigations. Reconstruct physical records. The streets around the Trade Center on the morning of September 11th were a place where the normal rules about what evidence looks like and where it goes and how it gets preserved did not apply. People moved toward the towers to help. People ran from them to survive. The landscape of Lower Manhattan in the hours after 8:46 in the morning was not a landscape that preserved the kind of granular, location-specific evidence trail that an investigation into one person's movements would normally be able to follow. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that is unlike any other case in this documentary, because the darkness here is not just the darkness of an unsolved disappearance. It is the darkness of a legal system being asked to reach a conclusion about one person's fate in the shadow of an event that made certainty about almost anything that happened in Lower Manhattan that morning structurally impossible to achieve. Two separate investigations reached two different conclusions. A private investigator named Ken Gallant, working on behalf of Sneha's family, developed a theory that her disappearance was not connected to the September 11th attacks, that something had happened to her on the night of September 10th or in the early morning hours of September 11th, before the planes hit, and that the timing of her disappearance in relation to the attacks was coincidental rather than causal. The NYPD investigation considered multiple possibilities, including voluntary disappearance, the theory that Sneha had chosen, on the night of September 10th, to leave her life and become someone else entirely. That theory was considered and was not ruled out by investigators, and it reflects the specific complications of her personal circumstances in the period leading up to her disappearance. It has never been confirmed. Here's what doesn't make sense about the voluntary disappearance theory, and why her family has resisted it consistently. The department store footage. The specific, mundane quality of the last confirmed image of Sneha Phillip, a woman in a store, running errands, doing exactly the kind of thing a person does when they expect to be somewhere tomorrow and the day after and the week after that. There is nothing in the available description of the surveillance footage that has been characterized as consistent with a person in the act of a deliberate exit from their life. There is everything in it consistent with a person doing ordinary things on an ordinary Monday evening. That does not prove she was not planning to disappear. It simply means the last documented image of her does not support that theory in any visible way. In 2008, the New York State Appellate Division issued a ruling in a legal proceeding related to Sneha Phillip's estate. The court ruled that she had died on September 11th, 2001, making her, in the legal record, the 2,751st victim of the September 11th attacks, the last name added to a list that had already been closed for years. The ruling was based on the reasonable inference, given the totality of the circumstances, her proximity to the World Trade Center, the lobby sighting 3 minutes before the first impact, the absence of any confirmed trace of her after that morning, that she had gone to the site of the attacks and had died there, possibly as a good Samaritan, a physician moving toward a disaster in the way her training would have pulled her. Her family has embraced that conclusion. The court's reasoning is documented and is consistent with the available facts, if not provable beyond the standard of direct evidence. But the physical record of the World Trade Center site did not produce remains or any material confirmation that Sneha Phillip was there on the morning of September 11th. The court ruling is a legal conclusion reached through inference. It is the most reasonable conclusion the available evidence supports. It is not the same as knowing. The distinction matters. not to undermine the ruling or the family's grief, but because this case exists in a space that most missing persons cases do not occupy, a space where the ordinary tools of investigation were rendered partially or wholly unusable by an event of such scale that the absence of confirming evidence is itself explicable by the event, rather than by the investigative failure or the deliberate concealment that usually explains such absences. The event erased the evidence. The ruling filled the gap that the erasure left. The question of what Sneha Philip was doing between the department store footage and the moment the legal record places her death remains, in the most precise, factual sense, open. A lobby camera in a building near the World Trade Center. A silhouette at 8:43 in the morning. 3 minutes later, a city that would never be the same. Sneha Ann Phillips' name is on the legal record of September 11th's victims. Her face is on the documentation of a disappearance that began the night before, in a store, in footage that shows a woman doing the most ordinary things imaginable on the last ordinary night the city she lived in would ever have. The next case starts with a real emergency call, a woman screaming that someone is trying to kill her, and the recording exists, and you can hear it, and it didn't save her. May 1st, 2010. Oak Beach, Long Island, Suffolk County, New York. Oak Beach is the kind of place that requires a specific kind of intention to reach, not a destination you end up at by accident, not a through road to somewhere else, but a deliberate turn off Ocean Parkway onto a causeway that leads into a gated coastal community of roughly 72 houses sitting at the edge of the Great South Bay, with the Atlantic Barrier Beach on the ocean side and marshland pressing in from multiple directions. The community is small enough that most of the residents know each other's cars, know the rhythm of who comes and goes at what hour, notice a vehicle or a face that doesn't belong to the usual rotation of people who live there or visit regularly. It is, in the particular way of small, insular, geographically isolated communities, a place where outsiders are visible by default, where arriving without context means arriving in a way that people around you can see and register, even if they don't do anything about it. The road in is the road out. There is no secondary exit, no alternate route through the community that leads somewhere other than back to the causeway and Ocean Parkway. Once you are inside Oak Beach, the geography of the place makes your options legible in a way that most residential communities do not. You came in one way, and you will leave one way. And the marsh does not count as a third option, because the marsh is not a route. The marsh is a destination from which you do not return by choice. At the eastern edge of the community, running roughly parallel to the last row of houses before the land gives way entirely, is a trench, a channel that fills with tidal water and reed beds, and the specific, lightless darkness of a coastal wetland at 4 in the morning, when the ambient glow from Ocean Parkway has faded, and the water in the trench is invisible from the road, and the reeds are tall enough to close over the top of a person who steps off the embankment into them. In daylight, with proper footing and full situational awareness, the marsh edge is a navigable thing. Before dawn, disoriented, moving fast, in the dark, it is something else. In the early hours of May 1st, 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert was somewhere in that community, in the dark, running. Shannon had come to Oak Beach that night in a car driven by a man named Michael Pack, her driver, who had transported her to an appointment with a client named Joseph Brewer at a residence in the community. Shannon was working as an escort. Neither she nor Pack had a particular familiarity with Oak Beach. It was not a neighborhood either of them moved through regularly, and the specific geography of the community, its single road in and out, its proximity to the marsh, its insularity, were not things either of them had reason to have mapped in advance. The appointment had proceeded, and then something had changed. The accounts of what happened inside the Brewer residence and what triggered what came next are not fully consistent across the various people who gave them, and the investigation has not resolved those inconsistencies into a single documented sequence. What the record does not dispute is the timeline. At some point before 5 in the morning, Shannon Gilbert left the Brewer residence in a state that witnesses and the 911 recording would document as acute distress. She was on foot, in an unfamiliar community, in the dark, moving away from the car that had brought her there. What is in the record, with documentary certainty is what happened at 4:51 in the morning. At 4:51 a.m. on May 1st, 2010, Shannon Gilbert called 911. The call lasted approximately 22 minutes. In it, Shannon told the dispatcher that someone was trying to kill her. She was audibly distressed. The characterization of her state in various accounts of the call ranges from panicked to incoherent, and the recording, which exists and has been described extensively in reporting on the case, captures a woman in a state of acute fear, communicating with a dispatcher who was working to understand what was happening and where she was, in a location that the dispatcher had no visual reference for, and that Shannon herself was struggling to describe with the specificity that an emergency response requires. Male voices were reportedly audible in the background of the call, at points a detail that the investigation noted and that has never been conclusively explained in the public record. The call did not result in a police response that reached Shannon in time to change what happened next. 22 minutes is a long time to be on the phone with emergency services and remain in danger. It is long enough that the recording of that call has become the most haunting single document, in this case, a real-time record of a person trying to communicate the specific nature of her emergency to a system that could not reach her fast enough to matter. During the call, and in the period after it ended, Shannon was moving through the Oak Beach community on foot. She knocked on the doors of at least 2 residences, neighbors who answered to find a young woman they didn't know, clearly distressed, asking for help, speaking in terms that the residents later described as frightened and confused. One resident, a man named Gus Coletti, answered his door and spoke with Shannon briefly. She asked for his help. He later described her as appearing extremely frightened, not impaired in the way a person impaired by a substance presents, but frightened in the way a person presents when they believe they are being pursued by something specific. He did not let her in, a decision he has spoken about publicly in the years since, with evident weight and without the clean resolution that a different decision might have provided. Another resident reported a similar encounter at their door, a brief, middle-of-the-night exchange with a young woman who was asking for help and then moving on. The community was awake in the fragmentary way of a residential neighborhood. At 4 in the morning, individual people responding to individual knocks without any coordinated picture of what was unfolding across the community as a whole. Shannon moved between houses and then moved toward the eastern edge of the community, in the direction of the marsh. Michael Pack had called 911 as well, separately, reporting that his passenger had fled the vehicle and was behaving erratically. The Suffolk County Police Department received multiple calls connected to the situation at Oak Beach in the early morning hours of May 1st. The response that eventually arrived on the ground came approximately an hour after the initial calls, a delay that has been scrutinized extensively in coverage of the case, and that the department has addressed in terms of the information available to dispatchers at the time. By the time officers were moving through Oak Beach looking for Shannon Gilbert, she was not in the community in any location that the responding officers could find. She had gone into the dark at the eastern edge of the houses, toward the marsh trench, and she was not there when they looked. Here's the critical detail, and it is one that expanded this case from a single disappearance into something that changed the public understanding of what had been happening on the Long Island Barrier Beach for years before that May morning. In December 2010, 7 months after Shannon Gilbert disappeared, and while the search for her was still ongoing, a police dog working the Ocean Parkway shoulder east of Oak Beach alerted to human remains in the brush at the road's edge. Those remains were identified. Then more remains were found nearby. Then more. By the time the initial discovery phase concluded, the remains of 4 women had been located in a concentrated area along Ocean Parkway, in the brush and scrub between the road and the beach. Women who had been working as escorts and who had been reported missing in the years before Shannon Gilbert disappeared. They became known as the Gilgo 4. The search that had begun because of Shannon Gilbert had uncovered evidence of a serial killer operating on the Long Island Barrier Beach, disposing of victims in a location that had held its secret for years because the terrain, brush-covered, remote from foot traffic, adjacent to a highway shoulder where stopping is unremarkable, was ideally suited to long-term concealment. Now this is where the case turns dark, in a way that has 2 separate layers, and the layers do not resolve into each other cleanly. The first layer is the Long Island serial killer investigation, a massive, ongoing law enforcement effort that eventually, in 2023, resulted in the arrest of Rex Heuermann, a Long Island architect who has been charged in connection with the murders of several of the Gilgo Beach victims. That investigation, and the arrest, and the ongoing legal proceedings around it, are a matter of public record. What is also a matter of public record, and what represents the second, more complicated layer of this case, is that the official investigative position regarding Shannan Gilbert is that her death was likely accidental, a drowning in the marsh trench at the eastern edge of Oak Beach, and that she is not considered an official victim of the Long Island serial killer. Her remains were found in December 2011, approximately 19 months after she disappeared, in the marsh area, approximately 3/4 of a mile from where she was last seen moving through the community. Her belongings, her bag, her shoes, other personal items had been found separately, in the days before her remains were located, scattered in the marsh and its immediate vicinity, in a distribution that the investigation documented, without resolving into a clean narrative of how they came to be where they were found. Here's what doesn't make sense, and what Shannan's family and their representatives have argued consistently and at length. The 911 call. A woman who is drowning accidentally in a marsh does not call 911 first and report that someone is trying to kill her. A woman who is disoriented or impaired and wanders into marshland in the dark does not knock on multiple doors asking for help from specific threats, does not sustain a 22-minute conversation with emergency services, does not move through a neighborhood in a pattern that multiple separate witnesses observed and described in terms consistent with each other. The 911 recording, the witness accounts of her behavior at those doors, the specific language she used to describe what was happening to her, all of it is consistent with a person who believed she was in danger from another person, not from a landscape. The official conclusion of accidental drowning has been contested by a private autopsy commissioned by the Gilbert family, which reportedly found evidence characterized as possibly inconsistent with accidental drowning, though the results of that examination were described as inconclusive rather than definitive in any direction that would support a specific alternate cause of death. Inconclusive is not exonerating. It is simply the honest edge of what the physical evidence would say. A person of interest whose name entered the public record in connection with the case, a physician named Peter Hackett, who some accounts reported, had contacted Shannan's family after her disappearance to say he had treated her that night, denied the claim through legal representation, and was never charged in connection with her case. The account of the contact was reported but not verified in the official record. Michael Pack and Joseph Brewer were both polygraphed and cleared by investigators. The question of who Shannan was running from, if she was running from anyone specific, has not been answered by the official investigation. It remains, officially, unknown, a designation that sits uneasily alongside a 22-minute 911 recording in which she said, clearly and repeatedly, that someone was trying to kill her. What the case left behind, beyond the personal tragedy of Shannan Gilbert's death, was a search that reshaped the understanding of what the Long Island Barrier Beach had been used for, and by whom. The families of the Gilgo Four and of the additional victims found in subsequent searches of the area owe the location of their loved ones' remains, in a grim and precise accounting, to a search that began because a young woman called 911 at 4:51 in the morning and ran through a gated community in the dark. The Long Island serial killer investigation that followed, and the 2023 arrest that the investigation eventually produced, trace their origin directly to that morning. None of it brings Shannan Gilbert back. None of it resolves the specific question of what she was running from, or what found her at the edge of the marsh before anyone who could have helped her did. The official record calls her death accidental. The 911 recording is 22 minutes long. The marsh at the eastern edge of Oak Beach looks completely still at dawn, the reeds upright and motionless in the absence of wind, the water in the trench invisible from the road, the whole landscape sealed and quiet in the way that landscapes are quiet when they have finished with what happened in them. The recording exists. The silence after it is the same silence every case in this documentary produces. At its end, a complete, comprehensive, unanswerable quiet that sits in the space where a person used to be. Our final case is the oldest, a man who vanished into 1930s New York, so completely that his name became a verb for disappearing. August 6th, 1930. West 45th Street, Manhattan, near Times Square. To understand what kind of city New York was in the summer of 1930, you have to understand the specific texture of the place at that particular moment, not the Depression-era gray that retrospective accounts tend to impose on everything after 1929, but the layered, contradictory reality of a city that was simultaneously broke and extravagant, that had speakeasies running full capacity behind unmarked doors and breadlines forming on the same blocks, that had a political apparatus so thoroughly organized around patronage and corruption that the machinery of city government and the machinery of organized crime had become, in many precincts and many offices, effectively the same machine operating under two different names. Tammany Hall was not a metaphor in 1930. It was an operational infrastructure, a system of political favors, judicial appointments, and financial arrangements so deeply embedded in the functioning of New York's Democratic Party that the men who moved through it did so with the specific, practiced ease of people who have spent their careers learning which doors open for whom and what the going rate is for the ones that don't open automatically. A New York State Supreme Court justice appointed in that environment, in that year, was a man who understood the architecture of that system from the inside. He had to. It was not possible to occupy the position without understanding it. Joseph Force Crater understood it very well. He was 41 years old in the summer of 1930, a Columbia Law School graduate who had moved through Democratic Party politics and legal practice with the kind of smooth, deliberate competence that the Tammany system rewarded and that the system itself had, to some degree, shaped. He had been appointed to the New York State Supreme Court earlier that year by Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, an appointment that was itself, in the accounting of those who later examined it, not entirely separable from the political and financial arrangements that governed how such appointments were made in that era. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a meticulous man, organized, punctual, attentive to the details of his professional and personal life in a way that made his eventual disappearance feel, to those who knew him, not just tragic but fundamentally out of character. He was not the kind of man who forgot appointments. He was not the kind of man who left things unfinished without a reason. He was the kind of man who, when he decided to do something, did it in a deliberate and prepared way. On the morning of August 6th, 1930, Judge Joseph Crater did something deliberate and prepared. He went to his courthouse chambers and spent the morning going through his papers. He sorted them, destroyed some of them, and directed that certain files and documents be removed. He cashed a check, a substantial one, approximately $5,150, a significant sum in 1930 by any measure. He arranged for the transfer of locked briefcases to his apartment. These actions, reconstructed afterward from the accounts of people who had been in contact with him that day, have a quality that is difficult to interpret charitably. In retrospect, a man settling accounts, clearing a record, moving resources into portable form. Whether that is what they represent, or whether there is an innocent explanation for the combination of document destruction, large cash withdrawal, and briefcase movement that the morning produced, is a question the investigation that followed never resolved. What is in the record is that the morning of August 6, 1930, was a morning during which Joseph Crater did a set of things that look, from the outside and in hindsight, like preparation. The background against which those preparations occurred is relevant. New York City was in the early stages of what would become a serious public examination of corruption in its government and judiciary. Investigations were beginning to surface the specific arrangements that connected political patronage, judicial appointments, and organized crime in ways that implicated people at multiple levels of the city's power structure. Crater's name had not been publicly prominent in that scrutiny as of August 1930, but the scrutiny itself was real and was moving. Whether he knew something specific about where it was heading, or whether his actions on the morning of August 6th were connected to that movement in any direct way, has never been established. It is the kind of background context that shapes the theories without resolving any of them. That evening, Crater called his wife, who was vacationing in Maine, and told her he was going back to the city to straighten some fellows out. The phrasing has been quoted so many times in accounts of this case that it has acquired the slightly worn quality of a line that has passed through too many retellings, but the content of it matters independent of the familiarity. He was going to straighten some fellows out. That is not the language of a man attending to routine professional business. It is language that implies a specific situation, a specific set of people, a specific problem that required his personal intervention. He did not elaborate on what the situation was or who the fellows were. His wife did not ask, or asked and received an answer that didn't clarify anything, or the call ended before clarification was possible. The content of the call is reconstructed from her account of it, given after the fact, and carries whatever weight a spouse's retrospective account of a brief telephone exchange carries, which is the weight of a person trying to remember a conversation they had no particular reason to commit to precise memory at. The time, on the evening of August 6th, Crater had dinner at Billy Haas's Chophouse, a restaurant at 332 West 45th Street, in the theater district near Times Square. He was not dining alone. He was with two companions, a lawyer named William Klein and a showgirl named Sally Ritz, in a restaurant that was, by the standards of the neighborhood and the era, a perfectly ordinary and respectable establishment for a New York Supreme Court justice to be seen in. Times Square, in the summer of 1930, was a specific kind of place. Theater marquees lit the street at night with enough light to read by. The sidewalks were busy with theatergoers and tourists, and the ordinary nighttime population of a neighborhood that runs on entertainment and the money that follows it. West 45th Street was not a quiet side street. It was a block in the middle of one of the most densely trafficked neighborhoods in the most densely trafficked city in the country. On an August evening in 1930, there were people on that sidewalk. There were cabs at the curb. There were eyes everywhere that the ambient energy of the theater district produces. Dinner ended. Crater had purchased a single theater ticket earlier in the day, one ticket, for a show called Dancing Partners, a detail that has been noted in every account of this case because of what it implies about his intention regarding the rest of his evening. He stepped outside Billy Haas's Chophouse onto West 45th Street, and here the record begins to fracture in the way that accounts given by people who are later asked to reconstruct a moment they had no reason to scrutinize at the time always fracture. His dinner companions gave accounts of what happened when they stepped outside together, and those accounts were not fully consistent with each other across the multiple times they were asked to give them. In one version, Crater got into a cab, hailed it from the curb, raised a hand in a wave to Klein and Ritz, and was carried off into the Manhattan night. In another version, he walked west on West 45th Street, moving away from his companions, and was absorbed by the crowd and the dark and the specific visual noise of the theater district in the evening. The accounts agree that he left. They do not agree on exactly how, or in precisely what direction, or what his demeanor was in the seconds before he was no longer visible to the people who had been sitting across a dinner table from him. Now this is where the case turns dark, in a way that is unique in this documentary, not because of the violence, or the wilderness, or the inexplicable gap, but because of time. Nobody reported Joseph Crater missing for nearly a month. His wife, in Maine, received calls and messages that apparently satisfied her, or did not alarm her sufficiently, or were interpreted in a context that made his absence seem explicable rather than ominous. His professional colleagues assumed he was away on personal business. The systems that might have detected a Supreme Court justice's unexplained absence did not detect it, or detected it and processed it in ways that did not generate an urgent response. The New York City Police Department was not officially notified of his disappearance until approximately September 3rd, 1930, 28 days after he stepped out of Billy Haas's Chophouse onto West 45th Street. 28 days. In a city where physical evidence degrades, memories blur, witnesses scatter, and paper trails that existed briefly cease to exist through the ordinary operations of time and inattention. The month-long delay did not create the mystery at the center of this case, but it guaranteed that the mystery would not be resolved by conventional investigative means, because the conventional investigative means had lost a month of relevance by the time they were applied. Here's the critical detail about what the investigation eventually found. or failed to find. Crater's locked briefcases, transferred to his apartment on the morning of August 6th, were gone when investigators searched the apartment. The safe deposit boxes he maintained were empty. The papers he had spent that morning sorting and destroying were gone in the way that destroyed papers are gone permanently, leaving no record of what they contained or why they had been chosen for destruction over the papers he had left in place. The showgirl, Sally Ritz, who had been at dinner with him that night, left New York shortly after the disappearance became public and was difficult to reach for questioning. She was eventually interviewed, and her account added to the record without resolving it. The investigation convened a grand jury that heard 95 witnesses and generated 975 pages of testimony, and the grand jury produced no indictment and no conclusion that named a responsible party or a specific explanation. Here's what doesn't make sense. Across the full set of theories the case generated in the decades after, a man of his visibility, in a city of that density, walked out of a restaurant on a busy midtown block on a summer evening and was never seen again. Not by anyone in a position to say with authority where he went. The cab theory, the walking west theory, the Tammany Hall silencing theory, the idea that people with reason to keep him quiet had the means and the motivation to ensure that he was quieted permanently before whatever was going to be straightened out with those unnamed fellows produced something public and damaging. The blackmail theory, which proposes that Crater himself was the subject of leverage rather than the holder of it, and that the leverage reached a conclusion that August night in a way that left no recoverable trace. The voluntary vanishing theory, the idea that Joseph Crater, facing whatever he was facing in the specific political and legal environment of New York City in August 1930, made a deliberate choice to become someone else, to take his cash and his portable assets and his knowledge of how the machinery worked and walk away from all of it into a different life. All of these theories have been advanced, documented, and discussed. None of them have been confirmed. None of them have produced a body, a witness, a document, or any physical trace of what happened to Judge Joseph Crater after West 45th Street on the night of August 6, 1930. In 2005, a handwritten note was discovered during the estate settlement of a woman who had lived in Coney Island, a note that claimed to know the location of Crater's remains, allegedly buried beneath what had been the Coney Island boardwalk in connection with a named individual and a specific set of circumstances. The note was taken seriously enough to be examined by investigators. The named location was investigated. Nothing was found that confirmed the note's claims. The note entered the public record as an unconfirmed account, which is the category that most of the evidence in this case occupies. He was declared legally dead in 1939. The case was officially closed by the New York City Police Department approximately 40 years after his disappearance, which is the bureaucratic acknowledgement that no further progress was expected. The chophouse at 332 West 45th Street is gone, demolished long ago, replaced by whatever the current iteration of that block holds, with no physical marker of the evening that ended on its sidewalk. His name became, in the New York vernacular of the decades after his disappearance, a verb, to pull a crater, to vanish so completely, in such a public place, with such thoroughness, that the vanishing itself becomes the thing people talk about, rather than the person who did it. A Panama hat raised in the direction of a cab window, or a figure moving west on 45th Street into the crowd, and then nothing. The most thoroughly disappeared man in New York history, gone in the middle of the most watched city in the world. On an August night in 1930, when the theater district was lit, and the sidewalks were full, and there should have been nowhere to disappear to, he disappeared anyway. 10 cases, 10 places, 10 people who left somewhere ordinary and did not arrive somewhere else. If you have been tracing this on a map, and the map is worth tracing, because geography is one of the few things these cases agree on, the pins are scattered across a state that contains multitudes. A Soho sidewalk, a wilderness preserve in Essex County, a suburban road in Colony, a rural highway convenience store in Oswego County, a mountain in the High Peaks, a Greene County night road, a lower Manhattan department store, a campus bus stop in Albany, a gated coastal community on Long Island, a midtown Manhattan chophouse block. The map does not show a pattern in the way a pattern is usually understood, a cluster, a corridor, a signature. It shows something less organized and more troubling than that. It shows that the state of New York, in its full geographic range and across 9 decades of its history, has places in it that look completely normal and have kept their secrets completely. We traced every step. The steps just stopped. The cold open of this documentary promised you a map, a glittering skyline dissolving into dark forest, a fog-choked highway, a coastal marsh. The image was chosen because it contains multitudes without being dishonest about any of them, because New York is all of those things simultaneously. And the disappearances in this documentary happened in all of those versions of the state. And the version of New York you are most familiar with is probably not the version where the missing person in your case was last seen. That is one of the things these 10 cases do collectively. And it is worth pausing on. They expand the map. They refuse to let any single version of New York, the dense urban grid, the empty mountain, the suburban strip, the rural highway, the coastal marsh carry the whole weight of what the word dangerous means. The danger in these cases is not a function of a place's remoteness or its darkness or its distance from help. Eton Patz disappeared on a block and a half of Soho in broad morning light. Judge Crater disappeared from a busy sidewalk in the theater district on a summer evening when the marquees were lit and the crowds were thick. Suzanne Lyall disappeared from a campus bus stop a short walk from her dorm on a Monday night when the campus around her was not empty. The populated places did not protect them. The witnesses did not save them. The familiarity of the route did not guarantee the arrival. That is the lesson the map teaches if you look at it long enough and resist the urge to explain it away. Here is what the 10 cases share, stated plainly, without the kind of forced pattern finding that long-form true crime sometimes reaches for, in order to give an audience a conclusion to hold on to. Every one of these people was close to a destination. Etan was a block and a half from his bus stop, with $1 in his pocket for a soda and a cap on his head that said Future Flight Captain. Douglas Legg was 150 yards from a cabin that was within sight of where his uncle last saw him turn around. Suzanne Lyall was a short walk from her dorm room, close enough that her suite mates had learned to recognize the specific sound of her keys in the lock. Karen Wilson was visible to 3 separate independent witnesses, moving in the right direction, 50 minutes into a walk she had made many times. Stephen Thomas had left his pack at the lean-to. You do not leave your pack behind if you are planning to go far. Heidi Allen was behind a register at a public highway junction at 7:42 in the morning, with her keys and her purse and her jacket, all still on their hooks and in their places. Audrey Herron was 12 to 15 miles from home on a road she drove regularly, with a raise behind her and a doctor's appointment ahead. Sneha Phillip was blocks from her apartment in a neighborhood she lived in and knew. Shannon Gilbert was inside a gated community whose single road in and out should have made her findable. Judge Crater was steps from a lit theater district sidewalk full of people on an August evening when half of Manhattan was out enjoying the summer night. Close. Every one of them was close. And close, in each of these cases, was not enough. That is the detail that the map communicates more efficiently than any amount of analysis. Proximity to safety is not the same thing as safety. The second thing the cases share is what they left behind. Not just people, but places that persisted unchanged while the people did not. Eton's route is still a block and a half of Soho sidewalk, still walkable in under 3 minutes, still the same distance it was on the morning of May 25th, 1979. Douglas Legg's trail is still 150 yards of familiar Adirondack terrain, unchanged in any meaningful way by 53 years of absence and silence. Karen Wilson's Fuller Road on-ramp is still there, still dark after sunset, still designed for vehicles rather than pedestrians. Still the same piece of highway infrastructure that offered her no shelter and no protection on the evening of March 27, 1985. Suzanne Lyall's Collins Circle bus stop is still on the SUNY Albany campus, still the end point of the same bus route, still the last place a classmate saw her stepping down from a bus and heading toward a dorm she never entered. The D&W Store Junction in New Haven still sits at the intersection of routes 104 and 104B. The gas pumps still visible from the highway. The approach still flat and open in every direction. Route 23 still runs west from Catskill into the Greene County hills, the fog still coming up from the valley floors in late August. The Oak Beach Marsh is still tidal and lightless before dawn. the trench still running along the eastern edge of the community, where the houses end and the reeds take over. West 45th Street still runs through the theater district, the block rebuilt and repurposed and rebuilt again in the 9 decades since the evening crater stepped onto it. The places persisted. The people did not. That asymmetry, the durability of the location against the erasure of the person, is one of the defining qualities of a cold case, and these 10 cases have it in full measure. The third thing, the one that is hardest to sit with, is the institutional dimension. Several of these cases involve a moment at which a system designed to help failed to move at the speed the situation required, and the failure was not the result of bad faith but of assumptions baked into the system that turned out to be wrong in the specific circumstances of a specific case. Etan Patz's school did not report his absence because in 1979, the systems that would now trigger an immediate parental notification did not exist, and the absence of them was not understood as a gap until a boy failed to come home. The hours between Suzanne Lyle's disappearance and the activation of a full missing persons response were lost to an institutional assumption that a college student's overnight absence was unremarkable, an assumption that her mother fought publicly and relentlessly enough to change that it became embedded in federal law as Suzanne's Law, which now requires immediate national database entry for missing persons between 18 and 21, eliminating the waiting period that cost those early hours in her case. Shannon Gilbert's 911 call lasted 22 minutes, and the response that eventually arrived at Oak Beach came roughly an hour after the first calls were made. Stephen Thomas's companions spent a night on the mountain calling into the dark before descending to report to rangers, losing the early hours of organized search in terrain where early hours matter enormously. In case after case, the gap between when something went wrong and when the institutional response reached full capacity is not just a sad detail in a chronology. It is a structural feature of how these cases became as cold as they did, as fast as they did. The systems improved, in many cases, because of the specific failures these disappearances exposed. Suzanne's Law exists because of Suzanne Lyle. New York's search and rescue protocols were reshaped because of Douglas Legg. The Long Island serial killer investigation began because a search for Shannon Gilbert found the Gilgo 4. The cases left marks on the systems. The people are still missing. The unresolved questions deserve their own accounting, stated plainly, without the false tidiness of a conclusion that the record does not support. Etan Patz. A conviction exists, a body does not. The legal record is settled. The physical record is not. Douglas Legg. The wilderness has not returned him in 53 years, and the leading theory is consistent with the absence of evidence without being confirmed by it. Stephen Thomas. 32 official searches, 600 climbs by his brother, and a mountain that has said nothing across 5 decades of being asked. Karen Wilson. 3 witnesses, a composite sketch, a road, and a silence that has run for 40 years without a named responsible party. Suzanne Lyle. An ATM transaction that someone made with her PIN, an ID that reappeared on campus weeks after she vanished, a case that changed federal law and has not been closed. Heidi Allen. A conviction, a contested legal record, a register that logged its last transaction at 7:42 in the morning and waited for a clerk who never came back. Audrey Herron. A vehicle that has not been found in more than 20 years despite sonar operations, dive teams, excavation, and pond drainage. Sneha Phillip. A court ruling, a silhouette at 8:43 in the morning on September 11th, a city that made evidentiary certainty structurally impossible by what happened 3 minutes later. Shannon Gilbert. A 911 recording that runs 22 minutes, an official finding of accidental drowning, a private autopsy that returned inconclusive results, a family that has not accepted the official answer and has not stopped saying so. Judge Crater. 9 decades, 975 pages of grand jury testimony, a name that entered the language as a verb for vanishing, and a West 45th Street that has been rebuilt and repurposed multiple times since the evening he stepped onto its sidewalk and was absorbed by the city he had spent his career inside. None of these cases close cleanly. That is not a failure of the documentary, or a failure of the investigation files, or a failure of the people who have spent years or decades working on them. It is the honest shape of what these cases are, open questions in the public record, attached to real people with real lives and real families and real futures they were moving toward when they disappeared, in a state that has not finished accounting for them. The open case file is not a narrative device. It is an actual document in an actual record system, attached to an actual name, in a database that accepts updates and has not received the one that would close the case. Waiting. The way these cases have been waiting, some of them for decades, some of them for nearly a century, for information that has not arrived yet and may not arrive in any timeline that feels satisfying or sufficient to the people who needed it most. Here is what the map looks like at the end. Zoom out to the full state. All 10 pins illuminated Soho, Newcomb, Colony, New Haven, the High Peaks, Catskill, Lower Manhattan, the SUNY Albany campus, Oak Beach, West 45th Street. The pins are spread across a geography that encompasses dense urban grid and remote wilderness and suburban strip and coastal marsh and rural highway and everything in between. They do not cluster. They do not form a shape that points toward a single explanation or a single kind of danger. They simply exist, distributed across the full length and width of the state, each one marking a place that looks completely normal on any given day, and that contains, if you know where to look and know what you are looking at, the coordinates of someone's last confirmed moment in the world. The bus stop at Collins Circle, the trail running back toward the camp at Santanoni, the junction of routes 104 and 104B in New Haven, the gas pumps still visible from the road, the lean-to below Mount Marcy's summit, 1 mile from the top, where a pack was left against the wall and never retrieved. The Fuller Road on-ramp in Colony, heading south in the dark toward a campus that was close enough to almost count as arrived. The Chophouse block on West 45th Street, rebuilt and renamed and carrying no marker of what ended on its sidewalk in 1930. The department store footage from Lower Manhattan, a woman running errands on a Monday evening, the last ordinary night. The marsh trench at the eastern edge of Oak Beach, where the reeds are tall enough to close over the top of what enters them. The night road running west out of Catskill into the fog of the Greene County Valley. The block and a half of Prince Street in Soho, still the same distance it was the morning a 6-year-old boy in a blue corduroy jacket walked it alone for the first time and did not reach the end. All of these places are still there. All of them look, on an ordinary day, like exactly what they are: a bus stop, a trail, a crossroads, a mountain lean-to, a road shoulder, a city block, a department store, a coastline, a foggy highway, a Soho sidewalk. Nothing about them announces what they contain in their histories. Nothing marks the specific square foot of ground where the record runs out and the silence begins. That is the part that should scare you, not the darkness, not the remoteness, not the specific convergence of circumstances that made each case possible. The normalcy. The way these places look on a Tuesday afternoon when you are passing through them without knowing what they are. The way they have always looked. The way they will look tomorrow and the day after, and in another decade, unchanged and unremarkable, and completely indifferent to the questions they are holding. Somewhere in New York, these places look completely normal. That's the part that should scare you. If this documentary moved you, subscribe. These cases deserve to be remembered, and we cover them every week.